Rebecca Voorhees came as a PhD student to Venki Ramakrishnan's lab in 2007, where she worked on the molecular mechanism of protein synthesis using X-ray crystallography. Along the way, she got a mention in Venki's acceptance speech for the 2009 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and equally impressively, she also acquired a full blue in water polo. For her postdoctoral studies, Rebecca moved down the hall to join Manu Hegde's lab, where she used single-particle cryo-electron microscopy to study how secreted and integral membrane proteins are specifically targeted to the endoplasmic reticulum. Rebecca moved to Caltech in July 2017, where she joined the Division of Biology and Biological Engineering as an assistant professor. Her lab focuses on two main questions: the molecular mechanism of protein biosynthesis and assembly, and how the cell recognises and degrades messenger RNAs and proteins that fail during maturation. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to take you back right to the beginning of your time here and ask you how you chose Venki's lab for a PhD.
So when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I worked for Scott Strobel, and so I worked on the sort of chemistry of peptide bond formation. So this is basically how the ribosome links together two amino acids. And I really enjoyed my time in Scott's lab, but it was pretty clear to me that the sort of cutting edge of the protein synthesis field was really in structural biology. And Venki's work was sort of pushing the boundaries of what was possible at that time. And so I came to his lab specifically because I wanted to work on ribosome structure. And I thought that his lab was doing some of the most exciting structure in that area at the time.
Mm-hmm. So was it a big deal for you to move to the UK?
Well, so I planned to come to the UK for 1 year. So I had a funding for what I was going to do as an MPhil degree. And I was going to go back to the United States and apply to MD PhD programs. So that was always my plan. I had taken the MCAT, which is this really painful 8-hour exam, entrance exam for medical school. I'd written all these applications. I paid all of the application fees. And I was just about to go on interviews, and Venki kind of sat me down and said, "Are you really sure you want to do an MD? Do you really need to do an MD?" And so I pulled all of my applications and decided to stay for a PhD, and then stayed for another 9 years after that.
So you're an escaped medic?
Yes, that's right. I like to say failed medic.
Oh, surely not. So I guess you came into quite a big community of students and postdocs at the LMB. What was that like? Was it supportive?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that made me really enjoy my PhD and my time, particularly as a PhD student, was that not only was there this community of PhD students at the LMB, but I think the fact that you're integrated into a college here in Cambridge is something really special about being a graduate student in Cambridge. And some of my best friends from graduate school are from that college, and my husband I met in our college. And so the opportunity to kind of interact not only at work with people who are doing molecular biology and things that were similar to me, but also people who were studying German history and poetry and, butterflies, all of those things, that was really something I enjoyed and was really kind of an amazing part of being a graduate student in Cambridge.
I guess that college system is pretty unusual for a PhD student then.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the US there are systems that are more similar to that for undergraduate students, but for graduate students, and there's nothing quite like it anywhere that I know of anyway.
Yeah. And that was how the water polo came about, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, I played water polo in undergrad, and then the fact that I could actually get to play for the university as a graduate student was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed.
Yeah, so I guess we should explain. So a blue is playing for the university.
That's right. Yeah, playing for the university, and usually usually you had to perform to some level, at least for water polo. And so we played against Oxford, and I think that year we had done particularly well, sort of in our conference. And
so did that involve a lot of training?
A few times a week it was, yeah.
Very early starts?
Not so much. I think it was quite late in the evening. It's because usually water polo is what happens after all the swimmers have finished, the kind of last dregs of the swimming pool time. But yeah, and Cambridge doesn't have a pool, so it was always kind of a bit all over the place.
That's true, isn't it? So where did you train?
We trained at the Lees, a little bit at Parkside. Those were probably the two main while I was here.
So I guess we should return to your life in the lab. So what was it like working for Venki then?
Working for Venki was really amazing. I think when I joined the lab, there was this really fantastic group of sort of students and postdocs that were really collaborative in his group. That was one thing that I've taken from Venki's lab, is that one of the things I enjoy most about science is working in sort of part of a small team and working with other people and tackling really hard problems together. And that's something that I have continued to sort of embrace in my lab. And that was something that was sort of this integral part of working in a crystallography lab at the time, and in particular the way Venki ran his lab. So.
Was it clear at the time that he was going to win a Nobel?
I think that there was always lots of discussion that, he probably was on a short list. I think that he himself had discounted that he was likely to make the sort of final three, because he hadn't been included in some of the big sort of, I don't know what you'd call them, but like predictive prizes. And so no one was really sure if they would ever give one sort of for translation or for structures of the ribosome, and then B, if they did, if he would be assigned to that top three, which is, of course, very difficult to sort of figure out and assign credit, I think, to just three scientists in any field.
So it wasn't like every October he got a bit irritable and...
No, and I mean, the day he won the Nobel Prize was actually, it's really funny, because I used to sit right outside his office, and that day he had a flat tire coming from work. And so he lives in Grantchester. And so he got in and he was late, he was wet, and he was really unhappy because he'd had to walk his bike, the 2 miles through Grantchester Meadows and things like that, to the building. And I remember him going into his office, and none of us had really clued in to the fact that it was sort of October and it was the chemistry day and whatever. And he got this phone call, and I remember I could hear him talking on the phone, and he said, he was like, this isn't a very funny joke. Like, I just don't think this is very funny. And he said, you have a very good Swedish accent, but I don't believe, this is just not funny. He's using such a bad mood. And, my colleague and I, was a postdoc at the time, Martin Schwang, we sat back to back, and we kind of look at each other like, Swedish accent. And then we were like, oh my gosh, it's October, right? And then Venki finally said, well, if this is real, then I should be able to speak to Måns Ehrenberg, who is a ribosome biochemist who's on the Nobel Committee. And then you could kind of hear Venki's like, stop talking. And he's like, and Martin had a bottle of champagne that we'd had stashed in the cold room for something else. I think we'd had a paper recently accepted. And he kind of gets it out, and Venki walks out of the office, completely shell-shocked. And it was, just a crazy day. But it was amazing, a once-in-a-lifetime experience for sure.
Yeah. Was there the traditional enormous party?
There was. And the funny thing about Venki, too, was that his wife... And this is how much I think Venki was not expecting this. His wife had gone hiking that day and hadn't brought a phone. And so we spent the whole day trying to call her and get a hold of her to tell her that he had won the Nobel Prize, A, and that B, she should come to the LMB for the party. And I think it took, 6 hours or something like that of calling her every half an hour and say, you should come to the lab. And
it seems like nobody wins the Nobel Prize and believes they've won it or is in any way prepared for it, actually. I mean, there must be some people who aren't quite that surprised, but they don't seem to be at the LMB, that's for sure.
Certainly it wasn't Venki. I think he really had discounted that he'd be on this sort of list.
Yeah. Did that change his personality or anything like that?
I don't think so. I mean, he was certainly very busy that year. The speaking engagements and invitations that come with the Nobel Prize was unusual for Venki, who didn't do a whole lot of traveling, actually. And prior to that. But other than that, he's still the same old Venki. I think he still has holes in the elbows of his sweaters, and he still carries all of his gym clothes in a shopping bag, and all of those things that the endearing qualities about him that we love didn't change. So
it sounds like a really nice place to have done a PhD.
It was. I was a very, very happy PhD student. I always think that it's sort of, when I think back to like my career in science, I think my PhD was my favorite sort of block of time.
Even writing up?
I didn't mind writing up that much. It wasn't so bad. I was lucky in that, a lot of the things that I'd worked on, we'd published papers, and so there's some place to start, and so I didn't actually mind that part. I don't mind writing so much, which is good for my current life now. I do a lot of that.
Yeah. And so part of the enjoyment of your PhD, I gather, relates to this object we have on the table.
Yes. Yeah, so this is, when I think back to sort of the formative things that happened during my PhD, this is, at that time, Venki's lab was doing only X-ray crystallography, and it was before most of the synchrotrons had the ability to enable remote data collection. And so we would freeze all of our crystals, and then we would all sort of travel to either France or to Switzerland and collect data. And so we'd go on these trips as sort of small groups in the lab, and everyone would take shifts at the beamline, because the beamline runs 24 hours a day. And so, you're there for 48 hours or so. And so you'd kind of have to take shifts so that everyone could get a little bit of sleep during that time, but still keep the beamline running. And I think one of the things that encouraged was this idea that everyone was kind of working together, that, everyone, to succeed, everyone kind of had to help each other. And this created this implicit atmosphere in the lab that everyone was kind of in it together, kind of like playing for a team or something like that. And I loved that aspect of science. And then also you got to go on these sort of amazing adventures with your colleagues. And so you made really close friends that I'm still in touch with now. I think in part because, you're sitting at a beamline at 2 a.m. and you haven't slept for 24 hours. And so people kind of, you learn a lot about people through that process. And so it's something that I think, I don't think students do that anymore. I don't know. I think I was first of all, I was one of the last people to do crystallography in Venki's lab, and certainly one of the last people to go to the synchrotron. And so it's a little bit sad that students don't get to do that, but it was something that really defined my time as a student, and something I enjoyed.
Well, the problems getting that through customs.
We used to ship these, actually.
Oh, right.
So we would ship them by FedEx. They used to bring them on the planes, but they didn't like the liquid nitrogen so much by the time I was a student. But there was always some sort of issue with the shipping, tracking, making sure it arrived. We had some doers that were supposed to go to France and ended up in California, and all sorts of craziness. But most part, the FedEx shipping worked okay.
Yeah. It sounds like real adventures going off to do that.
It was, yeah, exactly. And I think as a student, the opportunity to kind of travel and to get to go to a new place and to do that was really fun.
It's one of the perks of a scientific life, I think, that people who don't do science aren't that aware of how much travel you can do.
That's true. Although I will say that I think, and this is also what I used to say when people, my friends from college would say, oh, well, you're going to France and you're going to Zurich and things like that. It's like, yes, but we would fly there, and then we would go inside a synchrotron, which is like this insulated, lead-lined room, right, where there's no windows. And we would sit there for 24 to 48 hours, quite literally, and then we would fly back. And so it wasn't so much like we were touring the Alps or doing any of those sorts of things, but yes, we did. The opportunity to travel is something very special about academics.
Yeah. And when you finished with Venki, you chose to stay here and do a postdoc.
That's right.
That's an interesting decision. How did that come about?
It was complicated. I mean, so one of the reasons I decided to stay here was that I loved being at the LMB. I thought it was this really special place to do science. I also thought that the work in Manu's lab was really exciting, and the way that I really sort of admired the way that he thinks about scientific problems and his ability to communicate them to an audience. I think those are two things that he has this sort of incredible scientific intuition, and I was hoping it would rub off at least a little bit on me. But also, I had recently gotten married, and my husband was finishing his PhD, and then had a postdoc in London. And so I was looking for something local as well to make that half of my life work as well.
And was your postdoc as much fun as your PhD?
I think that I personally found my postdoc to be a lot more stressful. I think as a PhD student, at least for me, I had no other responsibilities except for being in the lab. And it felt like there's a lot less pressure. Of course, you want to get something done, you want to achieve something and hopefully find something interesting out about biology, but the bar is a little bit lower. And for a postdoc, there really did feel like I was on this sort of timeline where if things didn't work by some kind of deadline, then my chances of applying for academic positions were going to be pretty slim.
Sure.
And so I felt like that stress, or a lot more stress and sort of pressure during that time period than I think I did as a PhD student, which made it a little bit less fun, I would say.
Yeah. And you switched into cryo-EM at that point as well.
I did. I mean, it was pretty clear, and I think it is still clear that now, that was the future, and that crystallography just wouldn't allow you to look at some of the problems that would be possible using cryo-EM. And so basically, I spent the first 2 years in Manu's lab trying to crystallize a complex, and after 2 years of literally nothing working, I had nothing at 2 years. I threw out 1,000 empty crystal trays one day, and I went into Manu's office and I said, I think I'm going to do cryo-EM now. And luckily he said, okay.
Yeah, I'm starting to see why your postdoc was quite stressful.
And so I think, to his credit, I think he trusted, that sort of frustration. My frustration was heading in the right direction. I think he also saw what cryo-EM was enabling sort of around the building. And that was something I think being at the LMB really, gave us this sort of advantage, because we could see people solving structures that would have just been impossible to do by crystallography, sort of down the hall.
Yeah. So at the LMB, if you're trying to learn a new technique, how do you go about it?
I mean, I think, part of it, I'd been in the building for, I guess, 5 years, a bit longer, 6.5 years at that point. So I kind of knew who to ask. And so people were just extremely generous with their time in helping me learn and figure out what I was doing and sort of steering me in the right direction. And there were, the people in the cryo-EM facility were fantastic in sort of training me to use a microscope. And then the people who had experience solving membrane structures in Chris Tate's group and others were just, everyone was very helpful. And that's something that I think allows you to learn new skills at the LMB in a way.
Yeah, the LMB has a reputation of being quite competitive, but mostly it seems to be quite collaborative, actually. You think that's true?
I think it is. I think that there is, I never felt a sense of internal competitiveness. I mean, I think people were competitive within their fields, but there's enough diversity at the LMB. There's very few people who are really working on similar problems, and so I never felt like there was sort of internal competition. And people were always very helpful, or that was my experience. It was really rare that you would ask someone to help you or to take a look at something or to give you some advice and they would say no. It was more often that they would spend, sometimes hours of their time helping you with your problem, just because that was the ethos of the building and the institute.
Yeah. And I guess they don't have to spend so much time on teaching or writing grants here, so that must be quite helpful.
I think so, and I think that enables, people to have these sort of open door policies that you really can kind of walk into Shore's office and knock on his door and say, hey, I'm having some issue with Relion, can you help me? And he would usually say, yes, of course, I'll take a look. And I think that's hard if people are constantly traveling and have grant deadlines and teaching and all of those other sort of obligations on their time.
Do you think that's one of the reasons that the LMB has been so successful, that it's core funded?
I think so. I think that The core funding does a couple of things. I mean, it frees up people's time for sure. But I think it also, because everything is communal, I think that there is it encourages the sort of teamwork and sharing and sort of collaboration as a building. There's no reason why you can't borrow or take a reagent from one lab to try something new in your lab, because it's all the same pot of money, right? It doesn't really matter if it's sitting in one room or the other. It's still sort of LMB property. And I think also it really allows people to use the funding efficiently, because when you have sort of an individual lab and you have to buy every piece of equipment and every reagent just for your group, nothing is used 24 hours a day. Whereas I think at the LMB, sometimes it really is, because you have a whole building who's sort of sharing the equipment. And so I think that allows for a level of efficiency that's difficult to achieve when each group is sort of its own individual entity.
So structural biologists, by the nature of the beast, they have to share beam lines and so on. So do you think there's a particular thing about the structural biology field that makes it much more prone to sharing than, say, a cell biologist might be?
Potentially. I think, I think that certainly, having to negotiate how you get crystals to a beam line, or how you're going to divide, a 24-hour time slot at the synchrotron, encourages people to kind of have more open communication and sort of more give and take. And early on, when the first electron microscopes were really operational, it was really tight. I think we got one day every sort of 6 weeks. And so people were really good about kind of, if they got on the instrument and their samples didn't look that great, they would send an email, does anyone else need this time, and can we trade, and these sorts of things. And so I do think that helps encourage collaboration.
Yeah, there's not so much scope for the lone and surly genius, really, is there?
I don't think so, no. I mean, but I would say cell biology as well was really quite
Yeah, I don't mean to diss cell biologists, of course, I should say that.
No, I mean, because we shared our one tissue culture room with the whole our whole floor, our whole wing, I suppose. And so people, you still had that aspect of sort of give and take and kind of, really sort of unplanned interactions and discussions because about, what are you doing, and what is this, what experiment are you doing, because you're sharing all the same equipment. And so I think you still get a bit of it. Maybe not, it's not quite to maybe the same scale, but I think, at least in my experience, there's still a lot of communication and sharing.
Yeah, and the collaboration kind of gets over some of the issues about the small lab sizes here, I guess.
Yes, I mean, and I think that, I don't know, from running my own lab now, I do see that, I think on the very small end, I felt like it was difficult when, it was only 3 or 4 people in my lab. I felt like, it often felt like the lab was very empty. There just weren't that many people around, and if people had, I don't know, vacations or classes or whatever, they weren't in the lab, then it could feel quite lonely. But honestly, once you get up to sort of the 6 to 8 range, which is roughly, I think, about what most labs at the LMB are, although I've heard they're a little bit creeping up a little bit more potentially. I think that it's a really fantastic group size, because as a PI, from my perspective, there's enough people that things are happening, and you kind of have different projects going on at the same time. And so if one thing's not working, there's always someone who has something working, and so that helps lab morale. But it's not so big that I can't be involved sort of on the day-to-day with each person in the lab and know kind of what they're doing and help kind of brainstorm for each person. And so I do see the benefit of kind of that middle range group size. Not too small, not too big.
Yeah. So I think we've discussed beforehand that I actually asked Manu Hegde what questions he thought I should ask you.
Okay.
And so this is one of his. Is there anything you might do differently during your time at the LMB with the benefit of hindsight?
Oh, gosh. I think that the one thing that I think I could have done better was I did spend the sort of 2 years in Manu's lab trying to do crystallography. And I think I was, there's this sort of sunk cost fallacy, right? Like you invested so much time in doing this that I think I hung on to that project too long. And I think it was pretty clear, maybe 6 months, maybe even 9 months earlier, that cryo-EM was going to be sort of the future of structural biology for sure. And really, I think the future of cell biology. And so I think I could have moved on faster and been a little bit less worried about sort of learning new techniques. And that's something that I think I have or tried to embrace, or something I try to keep in mind in my own lab, that actually learning a new technique, in the end, it's not actually so hard if you can find someone to help you. And it will usually enable new ideas and sort of new strategies and new projects. And so I try to be as sort of least, little like nervousness, right, about doing that as possible. There's this sort of upfront cost in learning new techniques, but I try to keep in mind that in my experience, every single time I've done that and invested the time to do something new, it's turned out to be enabling and really worthwhile.
It must be quite daunting being a structural biologist, because the field moves so fast in terms of technology and techniques, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think I will say that I think I've tried to rebrand myself as, my lab does less and less structure, actually. We're doing more and more cell biology and sort of discovery-based biochemistry and less structure. I think when you see the writing on the wall with AlphaFold and, the competition for any type of structure that is sort of, feasible, honestly, that it makes it a little bit less, for me it seems like a little bit less interesting to kind of try to do something faster than, someone else. But when someone else will do the same thing in 6 months' time or something like that, as opposed to trying to find new questions that I think we maybe have a unique perspective on. And so I think that, I'll always, there's a special place in my heart for structural biology, and there's something magical about, sort of the first EM map or the first electron density map from crystallography. But I think realistically, and as my lab sort of moves forward, I think we'll do less and less structure and really think carefully about what structures we do try to solve and whether they make sense and sort of be a little selective.
Yeah. Before we move on to talking about what you're up to these days, you were here a long time as a PhD student, as a postdoc. Have you got any advice for a new starter here?
I think take advantage of. I think if I could give any advice about being at the LMB, it would be to take advantage of the resources around you. Get to know the longtime staff scientists who've been here for decades that know just about everything that A, goes on in this building, and B, has to do with the techniques and technologies that are in their labs. And that was something that I really appreciated about the LMB. And I think don't be scared to ask dumb questions. Don't be so worried about looking silly or like you don't know what you're doing. Because in the end, that's the only way you learn something new, and the only way you can kind of pick up new skills and techniques is by feeling a little bit stupid for a little, for a short period of time, hopefully.
Yeah.
And
And you're now at Caltech.
Yes.
Can you do a compare and contrast exercise for me?
Caltech, I think one of the things that attracted me to Caltech is that I think it has some qualities that are similar to the LMB, and that I think they value rigorous science as opposed to necessarily sort of trendy science, whatever sort of the latest, hottest new technique or technology. And I think that's something that's true about the LMB as well, that they really sort of value people asking these sort of sometimes unique or esoteric questions, but doing them really well. And that's something that I think is similar about Caltech. It's also quite collaborative, so there's this sort of ethos of people talking to each other and interacting and helping each other out, which were things that I appreciated. I mean, it's very different in that it's not centrally funded, and so there's a lot more of sort of individual labs being a little bit not completely on their own, but you do sort of have to be a little bit more self-sufficient than I think you were at any individual lab at the LMB had to be. And it's I will say I do like living in California. There's something to be said for the sun, I think, and so that's something that is quite different. I haven't worn my rain trousers in 5 years, so I have them in my closet, but they haven't been necessary. So.
You could probably frame them and
yes, potentially. I almost brought them with me. That was the other thing I thought I could bring as my artifact from the LMB, but.
Oh dear. Sounds so good. Do you think it's more competitive there because the way it's funded differently, or the career structure?
Certainly not internally. Again, I think because Caltech is quite small, and so I think similar to the LMB, I think our biology division is probably a similar size, maybe a bit smaller even than the LMB, and so there is everyone is in quite diverse areas, and there's very little overlap between individual labs. And so I do think that there's no reason for anyone to feel like, there's not room for everyone to be successful together. And so I've never felt like there's sort of internal competition. I think there's always competition in individual fields, but that was true with the LMB too.
Yeah. So what do you think the hardest thing is in running a lab?
I think the hardest thing in running a lab is doing all of the things I wasn't trained to do. I found very quickly that, my job, the science is kind of the same. I mean, it's on a bigger scale than it was as a postdoc, but you're still making strategic decisions about what to do next, thinking about what's kind of the next biggest problem. That all felt very, very familiar. What didn't feel familiar was sort of being a therapist and a cheerleader and a sort of all of those sort of interpersonal things, a HR manager, a CEO, and I don't know, all managing finances, all those things that we just didn't do or know very much about as a postdoc or a PhD student.
And do you get help in doing all these things at Caltech, or you just expected to get on with it?
There's lots of support, but I do think there's some elements of sort of you learn via failure and making sort of mistakes and hopefully not making the same mistakes twice. And you can go on courses on mentorship and you can talk to people about how they mentor students and postdocs in their lab, but there's no substitute for kind of actually doing it and finding out what works for you and what works for individual trainees, because everyone is a little bit different about what they need. And that's been hard to figure out, and I wouldn't pretend that I am very good at it or fully feel like I know what I'm doing, but I think I've gotten a little better, and that's kind of always my goal in the back of my mind, to get a little better at these things every year, and I think I'm meeting that bar anyway.
Did you have someone you considered to be a mentor?
I think so. I think that one of the things that students and postdocs don't think very much about is that when you're working for people, they become lifelong mentors. Of course, it's a different relationship when you see someone every day and you're actually physically in their lab. But Manu and Venki are still people that I call up and ask for advice on sometimes scientific, sometimes not, political questions, how to deal with sort of departmental politics and things like that. And so I really do think that you're, especially if you stay in academics, but even if you don't, these people become sort of lifelong mentors. And I've been very lucky that I have two that are willing to still, pick up the phone when I call with these questions and sort of give me advice.
Have you ever felt the lack of women who could be mentors?
So I think that certainly when I was first started at the LMB, there were very few female group leaders. And even when I left, I think there were very few tenured, sort of more senior group leaders, but it's changed a lot, which is really nice to see. But I think it's just a sort of inherent truth in science that there's an underrepresentation of women and people of color, and that's something that we're grappling with, I think, in the United States especially, but I know here as well, and something that I hope seems like it is improving, and I hope will continue to do so.
Did you view yourself just as a scientist or as a woman scientist, do you think?
I think I viewed myself as a scientist until the day I had a child.
Yeah.
Actually, potentially the day I could no longer hide a pregnancy. I think there's this change where there's something uniquely sort of that affects women scientists, you know, when just the biology of sort of carrying a child and giving birth to a child that really delineated for me the difference between, you know, being just a scientist and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, right, I am a woman scientist, I guess.
So your son was born while you were at the LMB during your postdoc?
My daughter was born,
Your daughter,
yes,
sorry.
that's okay. My daughter was born, yes, in 2015 while I was a postdoc in Manu's lab, just, you know, across the way at the Rosie. And then I had a son just 3 years ago now while I was an assistant professor.
So is there a best time to have a child?
No, I don't think so. I think what I tell trainees is that there is no good time, but there are sometimes bad times. And so there's I think no matter what, there's no good time to sort of take time out for a scientific career. You very much feel a little bit like you're on a treadmill, you know, that things will kind of continue on without you if you take time out. And there's no good time for it. I think there are times that are harder and easier maybe a little bit, but in the end, I think, you know, if you want to have a family, I think you just have to make a decision to do it and figure it out. And that was actually advice that I got from Lori. And she got that from Daniela Rhodes. And so I felt very much like there was sort of this chain at the LMB that, you know, you kind of just have to decide you're going to do it. And, you know, through sheer bloody-mindedness, you'll kind of get through it and it will be hard. But if you want to make them work, you'll figure it out.
Do you think the attitude towards having children as a scientist is different here to how it is in the US?
I don't know if it's different here. I think there's sort of issues everywhere. I think there are sort of concrete structural problems that we're grappling with, I think, worldwide, honestly. Things like affordable, available childcare that ideally is close to where you work. There's something, you know, you can't underestimate the value of being able to go pick up a sick child and not have to drive 30 minutes or try to bike, you know, halfway across the city. I think, you know, support for people taking leave, that's really critical. Places, you know, accessible lactation rooms, that's something that I think, you know, certainly when I was at the LMB and also at Caltech is not as accessible or as available as I think would be helpful. So those are sort of structural problems everywhere, but I think the harder things to address, actually, because those really can be addressed with money. Those are just financial problems, are these sort of implicit biases. I think there's still an attitude, things that I've experienced, I think a little bit both here and in California, is that women who want to have a family maybe aren't as serious about their careers.
That's still the case.
Oh, yes, or aren't as ambitious as sort of others that are willing to potentially sacrifice that aspect of their lives. And those are harder to sort of fix because that's just sort of how people feel. And so until those kind of attitudes change, I think it'll always be challenging. But the structural problems are just financial issues, I think, at this point.
It's kind of depressing to hear you say that, you know, 40 years on from where people started expressing this problem.
I mean, and I will say, I think at the LMB, as a trainee, I felt fairly shielded from that. And it was really only kind of as I started to become more independent that you start to hear those kind of comments, actually, people who are brave enough to say them to your face and things like that. But it's...
I think rude is the word you're looking for, not brave.
Yeah, well, and so, you know, it is hard to hear that. But I do think also it's why I'm very open with trainees about my family and my commitments outside of work. And so sometimes I leave at 3:30 because I have to pick up a child from school or they need to go to a concert or whatever it is. And I'm very open about why I'm leaving and what I'm doing because I want people to know, you know, it's not easy by any stretch, but it's possible. And I don't think that, you know, we don't want to lose women scientists because they say, well, I really want a career and it's just not possible to have both. And so I try to at least do, my part in normalizing these decisions.
So what do you say to people who accuse you of not being serious about your career?
I think that I think that I actually find it very motivating. I have a little sort of pile of things on my desk that I find as motivation, and every time my lab does something exciting scientifically, I kind of feel like, well, that's the best way to sort of combat this attitude is to be successful, and despite all of the sort of perceptions that maybe you're not serious or maybe you're not able to work as much. And I will say it's true. If I didn't have children, I could probably work more hours and work more. But I was never willing to sacrifice that sort of side of my life for science. And I think men are never really asked to do that either. And so I felt like it just wasn't fair.
Yeah. So is science something you'd recommend to your daughter as a career then?
There are some amazing, I think there's this sort of, I think that science in general is going through this reckoning right now of, trying to deal with some of the structural problems that have been sort of pervasive in science, just like all of the other industries, the way people are treated, the long training path, how much people are financially supported, particularly as trainees. And so, I think that there's a lot of discussion about some of the negatives of academic science, but not maybe as much discussion about some of the positives. And so I think I really love the flexibility and the freedom. One thing I think we don't talk about enough is that really being a group leader or being in science in general is one of the most flexible careers you can possibly have. And I think for me, having 2 young children during a pandemic, I absolutely took advantage of that flexibility. Sometimes I was supervising Zoom kindergarten in the morning during office hours, but then I could get back to my work, maybe in the evenings or at sort of odd times as I could fit it in. And so it is enormously flexible, the intellectual freedom, and then, working with trainees, I think mentorship and sort of working with graduate students and postdocs and watching them through this really critical part of their sort of life, both scientifically and personally, because usually that period of time from sort of 22 to 30 is a really a time of huge growth for people. It certainly was for me. And so to get to be a part of people's lives during that time is really something I really love. And so I would say I think if you want to do academic science, I would recommend it to anyone. But it's not easy, of course. It's a hard training path, lots of uncertainty, but there are certainly some advantages.
Rebecca Voorhees, thank you so much for coming to talk to us.